This lecture focuses on the 1980s. So we're going in our overview. We'll start with postmodernism, which is as I wrote here, the dominant philosophical trend of the 1980s. Um, and what postmodernism does is sort of tackle the whole notion of modernism, and really we see it in the arts, and we'll see it in fashion as well. So it questions modernism, it critiques it. There are ironic and irreverent references to it, there are quotations from it. Deconstruction is a part of this, and it's really a linguistic philosophical practice that's a part of postmodernism, as I said, but first started with language by the philosopher Derrida. But as I mentioned here, it will be a term applied to fashion as well. And I always describe it as, think of deconstruction as taking a garment, like a suit, taking it apart, putting it back together again in a way that it, where it doesn't fit the same way that a traditional suit would. So we're going to see this in the 1980s. We'll see altered proportions and the forcing objects together with no regard for what they are, or what their colors are, or what their shapes are. Bright colors. Another trend is aggressive sexuality and distorting proportions, like massive shoulders. This has led some people to call the 1980s the decade of excess. Another extremely important trend is the punk rock movement and punk fashions. Um, so I gave you sort of who, what, where, when, and why. Um, there's a center of it, and a very strong center of it, that starts in London in 1976. But there's also an earlier 1970s version that's a lot more sort of rock and roll. That's happening in New York City as well, concurrently. So in England, it starts with art students and young employed people. There's a huge economic downturn. Um, and it's really anarchic, nihilistic, and a reaction against the hippies. Okay, and greater trends in the 1980s. In the US, we'll see classic day wear like Perry Ellis and Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren, right? And sporty leisure clothing. In Europe, you'll see glamorous fairy tale looks, ethnic looks, retro looks, a lot of really hyper feminized looks. And then in Paris, a really major occurrence will be the Japanese challenge, drab, shapeless bodies that muffle the shape the shape of the body. There are many historical references that are going to happen in 1980s fashion, and probably the 1950s is probably the most prevalent trend. This is Malcolm McLaren on the left and Vivienne Westwood. Malcolm McLaren was a music producer, and Vivienne Westwood was his girlfriend. She is responsible for a great deal of punk fashions, and she's extremely important both as a fashion designer and within this burgeoning punk movement. So all of us know what punk rock styles look like, but let's look at the early 70s. On the left, you have the punk band the Sex Pistols, and I had their first album, God Save the Queen, which is really excellent, rebellious album. They were not very nice human beings. They had habits like throwing up on people deliberately, and Sid Vicious, who you see on the upper left, died of a heroin overdose, so they weren't too savory of characters. On the right, what I'm showing you is very early punk rock styles. What I want you to understand is it is not anti-fashion, because anti-fashion in a way is like a negation of fashion. This is like a melange of things, like a motorcycle jacket with leather pants and studs and chains, and it's really embellished, and it has all these personal messages on it. It is not anti-fashion, so don't get it confused with anti-fashion. Okay, you need to know this outfit because this is one of the most iconic punk rock outfits ever. And it was made by Vivienne Westwood, who I showed you earlier. So she does a show called Seditionaries, and this is a woman walking the garment down the runway on the right. So this is referencing many things, right? It's referencing a motorcycle jacket, and it's referencing women's wear for men. There's a skirt involved in the ensemble on the left, and it references bondage, these sort of straps that restrict your movement, which I always thought was very ironic about punks because they were all supposed to be so tough, but yet they would have these, straps where they couldn't really, for example, run, run in them. But anyway, this is that kind of bricolage. It's a mishmash of all these styles that is coming together, that is part of the postmodern current and why we start the 1980s in 1976. So here on the left is a picture of Johnny Lydon wearing Vivienne Westwood garments. So she's distressing and tearing things and silk screening on them. And she had many shops, but the first shop that she opened was called Sex in 1974. So this is a color example of how florid punk rock was. Bright colors, dyed hair, um, the combination of studs and safety pins and torn clothing and remade things. And this is just the prototype of punk that we see in variations to this day. Now we're going to look at some high fashion designers who incorporate aspects of punk rock fashion into their looks. This is a Zandra Rhodes ensemble, a dress, and do you remember her from the 1970s? She was making her own prints, hand making her own prints and layering these hippie-like chiffon pieces. Well, look at this. She's got safety pins and she's thrashed and torn the chiffon. So this is an example of high fashion, or copying punk rock. So a couple of Gianni Versace examples. So here you have Elizabeth Hurley, the actress, in the middle, wearing a characteristically gold and black Versace sexed up outfit, but lo and behold, there are gold safety pins. And here's another look on the right where he took apart a dress and put it back together with the safety pins. On the far left is Johnny Lydon, aka Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols. One of the reasons why Vivienne Westwood is so interesting is not only because she was there at the inception and the creation of really important punk rock looks, but then she just ventures out into all these different areas. So this particular collection was her unisex pirate collection, and it's really darling. The model on the left, she gave her a wrapper from the inside of a cigarette pack to make her look like she had gold teeth. And it's referencing, uh, pirate outfits. Sorry, motorcycle. Pirate outfits from the 1600s and 1700s. So here are a couple more new romantic looks. So you can see the image on the right is, it's alluding to punk with this wild, crazy, hair sprayed up styled hair, but it's got a lot more feminine underpinnings with a lot of ruffles. And this was a really big style when I first came to New York. These are a couple of new romantic bands. Adamant on the left, who dressed kind of like he was General Custer in the Civil War. And on the right, Duran Duran. So here we have Grace Jones, who recorded a wonderful album called Night Clubbing that I recommend to all of you. It's really great if you haven't heard it. But I've included her here not only because, did I mention the 1980s is about extremes? So she has this wonderful high top hairstyle, um, and she's perfectly groomed, but look at how big and broad her shoulders are. We're going to discuss this. In the 1980s, this kind of suit with the enormous shoulders was called a power suit. So you really need to know what a power suit is, because a power suit is really prevalent in 1980s. And what it is a menswear styled suit for women with lapels and a collar, double-breasted or single-breasted, and it has enormous, ginormous shoulders, and it can come with a skirt or pants, but it is the characteristic look of sort of yuppie businesswomen in the 1980s. Okay, so that short hair with those menswear looks for women, very 1980s and highly unflattering. It's not a little Audrey Hepburn pixie look, people. Um, Here are Armani suits. He was known for making these luxuriously, in using luxurious fabrics and making these beautifully crafted garments. You know, Italy has a big, important fashion industry, very high end. So here's a good example of an editorial, a photo editorial for a magazine styled for the yuppie crowd, the young urban professional, and the characteristic big hair, big shoulders, excess of the 1980s. So the Italian brand Moschino is really part and parcel of this kind of ironic references to the past. So they're taking their name here on the left and blowing it up really big on a belt buckle. And now you see that all the time, but that was very new in the 1980s. And on the right is a photo I took at the Met of a dress called the dinner dress, where the napkin and the plastic fork, knife, and spoon were like literally stuck to the dress. Two more Moschino looks. So on the left, you see the hanger on her head that's a stand-in for a hat, and on the right, she's got a necklace of teddy bears. Ironic and playful. Vivienne Westwood continues on with a Buffalo collection in the early 80s. Um, Again, just breaking with any kind of, I mean, she's just a true original. But here she's layering garments, and look at that, putting outerwear, innerwear as outerwear. In other words, taking a foundation garment, i.e. a bra, and putting it on the outside of a garment. So it's kind of a deconstruction moment that's very significant, and she's a true originator. So these are a couple more looks by Vivienne Westwood. She also goes into history again, just over and over again. And here referencing 18th century corsets, meaning corsets from the 1700s. Okay, we can't skip Lady Di's importance in the 80s. Um, she is here in her wedding, posing at her wedding to Prince Charles in 1981. And look at the sleeve on that dress, because this is part of the 80s. Ginormous sleeves. She's going to be a major style icon. So I'm going to finish this first part with Lady Di, as she was known. So she's featuring something on the left that is a direct reference to the 1930s, big backless evening gown, but with huge shoulders. And then on the right, this sporty little striped suit, of course, with hugely stuffed shoulders. So if we had access to the collection, I would show you just how enormously padded the shoulders were in the 1980s.